Thank you.
And you're going to be doing some talking about myths.
Yeah. There's quite a few myths associated with Christianity, and it's there's so many of them that it's hard to know where to like start poking. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the Jesus birth myth, and see what was the real story behind that, and so on, and of course, if you have Jesus as not being a of divine origin, then a lot of Christianity kind of falls on its face. A lot of the it's a fundamental myth in Christianity, a fundamental tenet.
He must be God incarnate.
Right.
He can't just be a prophet or something like that.
Right. So I'd like to maybe begin here a little with a quote that I found on the web. It says, "Clearly, the Christians have used myths in fabricating the story of Jesus' birth. It is clear to me that the writings of the Christians are a lie, and your fables are not well enough constructed to conceal this monstrous fiction." This is written by a man named Celsus in 178 AD. So apparently this idea that Christianity is based on myths is not a new idea. Apparently, let's see, it says here that Celsus was one of the foremost thinkers of his age. His critique of the Christians was so damaging that Christians destroyed every copy of his work they could find. So this birth myth is basically the idea that God comes down and finds this Virgin Mary and more or less impregnates her, and she, as a virgin, bears the child Jesus, and this husband of hers, Joseph, kind of tags along as an extra. Turns out he's important for another myth that didn't quite make the prime time. So, as we like to say, skeptics like to say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so, what is the evidence that we have of the virgin birth story? And it basically comes down to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. It turns out there's really there's no evidence at all of Jesus actually having lived outside of the Bible. So,
in terms of physical evidence or other writings to back it up,
right. There have been some writings, but they've been pretty much scholars believe they're hoaxes and made up after the fact, which turns out to be a fairly common thing. So we have Matthew chapter 1, verse 18, when his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph before they came together, which means before they. Anyway, she was found with the child of the Holy Ghost. So that's the Matthew version, or the important. In Luke, they say it says, "And behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb and bring forth a son, and shalt call his name Jesus." Then later it says, "Then Mary said unto the angel, How shall this be, seeing that I know not a man? And the angel answered and said unto her, The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee." So the power of this myth is largely due to these two quotes and
two lines.
There's a little bit more here and there, but basically it's the two Gospels of Matthew and Luke. But let's back up a little bit and examine these in kind of a bigger context. There were sort of two things that were very important in the history of Christianity at this time. One is that there was this covenant with David, King David, and this is back in the Old Testament in Psalms 89. 3 and 4, and then 34 and 37. And the idea here is that God made this big promise to King David that his line, his progeny would reign forever. And this was a very big promise, and unfortunately, it was a broken promise. The line of David was broken. He at some point, let's see, but the Davidic line of kings ended with Zedekiah, and there were none during the Babylonian captivity. So basically, this promise was broken. Okay, and this was actually a very big deal to these guys, because when God makes a promise, you got to keep it, right? You want to kind of trust the big guy, and how could he possibly be a liar, right? So that's one big thing going on, and the other big thing is that we had Paul, who was kind of the main main apostle, the main storyteller about Jesus. In fact, I would think that we wouldn't have the Jesus Christ myths if it weren't for him. He was kind of the opinion that the Christ part of the myth was that we had Christ as sort of an apparition and was purely a spirit being. Okay. And at the time, they were actually kind of very uncomfortable with this idea that a holy being would actually have a corporal form. That was considered a rather dirty thing, and actually, it's this very squeamishness with this dirty human thing is actually the source of a lot of our sexual taboos and so on. So he finally capitulated because he was trying to promote this crucifixion story, right? And if you have a spirit being who's crucified, it's just not very compelling. You got to have the blood and guts in order to make people kind of interested in it, and you have the suffering and sacrifice in order for it to be compelling.
Yeah, that's what we recognize as suffering.
Right, right. And if the spirit being is suffering, it's kind of hard to buy into that. Yeah. Okay. So also in kind of the related areas here, we have this notion of pious frauds. There were actually it was a pretty common occurrence to come up and spin doctor things and do various things. One thing that they did is called a midrash, which was basically to take an old quotation or an old passage and spin it for the current circumstances. And this was a common occurrence. Another pious fraud was passing off a text as written at an earlier time so that you can prophesize what's happening today, and say, oh, this prophecy came true, when in actuality the text is written in a more modern time.
Okay, so you're saying that they wrote the text
as if it were in the past.
And then dated it.
Right.
1950.
Right. So that's a great way to do that. Another little trick was false accreditation. For example, the Gospels of Luke, Matthew, and so on were supposedly written by the apostles, but in reality they're just attributed to the apostles. So it's been meant to kind of give them extra oomph. So another thing going around is there were tons and tons of myths floating around in Rome at this time. Rome had conquered vast territories and lots of different peoples, and they traded with even more people. And it's a big melting pot at the time, so there was a great mixture of myths and things. And in particular, we have Mithraism, which was a religion that coexisted with Christianity but began much earlier. And we have Mithra was born of a virgin. And his birth is celebrated December 25th, and performed miracles with 12 disciples, held a Last Supper, and was resurrected after 3 days in the spring equinox, and ascended to heaven. Now, does that sound familiar to anybody?
Just vaguely.
Just vaguely familiar. So the more you examine this, the more you look at these myths coming in, you wonder about that. There's Zoroaster, Horus, Krishna, Bacchus, Prometheus, Indra. All of these deities were supposedly born of virgins and shared many other attributes with Jesus. So these are floating around in the Greek.
A lot of those were centuries before Jesus.
Oh yes. All of these were sort of in existence long before Jesus was claimed to have been born. So this is old stuff. In the Greek myth, Perseus was born of Virgin Diana, who was conceived by the god Zeus, who took the form of a shower of gold. Humans were actually considered of virgin birth as well. We have Romulus, who is the legendary founder of Rome, was born of a Vestal virgin. Plato was claimed to be the virgin son of Apollo, and so on. So this is kind of a common thing, ho-hum, right?
Yeah.
So let's take a look at this evidence a little bit more. We have we have this Bible story is really the only story that's promoting this, and we can kind of look at that a little bit. We know quite a bit about biblical history. We know when the various Gospels were written, approximately, and what we find is rather interesting. We have in the earliest epistles of Paul, the letters of Paul, this is sort of the earliest writings, which is dated around 51 to 64 AD or CE, Common Era. I should mention here that Paul never met Jesus. He in fact, none of the people who wrote actually knew Jesus firsthand. So it's all sort of hearsay.
Okay.
And in these epistles in Galatians 4:4, Paul is said that Jesus was a son born of woman and born under the law. Okay, and what this really means is this is him sort of capitulating on the spirituality thing, or the spiritual being thing. Is he's saying, well, Jesus actually existed in human form, is what's being said here, not that there's a virgin birth. And he's sort of saying also that he's born under the law, meaning that he's not an illegitimate child. Okay. So
what was the implication before that?
Well, you see, if you have this virgin birth, if you have this woman who doesn't know who the daddy is, then the child is potentially illegitimate, right? So that's a problem.
So
right?
God is running around cheating on people?
No. Well, actually, let me continue here. In Romans 1 chapter 1 verse 3, we have Jesus Christ our Lord, which was made from the seed of David according to the flesh, and then declared to be the Son of God. So, as it turns out, what's going on here is there's a lot of the myth surrounding Jesus is actually trying to make him one of the descendants of the Davidic line.
Yes.
So they go to great pains to construct this myth, and then everybody forgets it and says, "Oh, virgin birth." So Paul is trying to make the point that Jesus was a descendant of David and therefore is a supposed ruler, and to try to resurrect that sort of problem, or to try to fix that sort of problem. But what's interesting here is in Paul's epistles, which is the earliest writings about Jesus, he mentions nothing of the virgin birth. There's nothing mentioned about Jesus' supposed works or any of this magic that supposedly went on. And Paul's sort of job, if you will, was being a missionary, right? And if he had this wonderful story, why would he not promote it? Why would he not try to say something about it? So that, and then later on we have the Gospel according to Mark, which is dated around 70, and there's no mention of the birth at all. So if it were kind of an unusual birth, you'd think it might be at least mentioned, right?
More as a footnote, if nothing else.
Yeah, just hey ho, virgin birth or something, right? So Mark didn't mention that at all, and in fact, in Mark he has Jesus' family kind of thinking he's kind of nuts for preaching, which if I had a kid that was was
supposedly the Son of God,
a semigod, a demigod, I'd kind of cut him a little slack. So they thought he was nuts. In Matthew, we have this association of the virgin birth, and a reference to Isaiah, which is another little interesting thing, which I think we can get into maybe a little later. And it turns out that Luke is based on Matthew. Biblical scholars think that Luke, basically borrowed a lot of the elements of Matthew and added to it and such. So there's not much there. These two Gospels, Matthew and Luke, go to great pains to outline this lineage from King David, right? And unfortunately, they have very different lineages. One in Matthew, they trace Jesus to David in 28 generations. In Luke, it's 41 generations. So that, they don't quite have their story straight between them. But I think the big point here is if you can't have Jesus being the descendant of David and a virgin birth from God at the same time. Those are two mutually incompatible notions.
Yeah.
They have nothing to do with each other. So, which version of this myth do you really want to have? So, then in the Gospel of John, they actually kind of more or less explicitly deny this virgin birth story. They actually kind of, you have to read between the lines a little bit to sort of say that so Jesus is sort of denying this story about himself. He's being presented with this story, and he basically says no.
So it's kind of some bickering as into what's more important. Is it actually the Son of God, or is it David's descendant?
Right.
Which is more important?
Right. So there's a definite tug of war here going on. So there's some other problems. The Encyclopedia Britannica says that Christians count 133 contrary notions of different authorities concerning the year the Messiah appeared on the earth. So there's 133 different versions of when Jesus was born.
Wow.
Talk about not getting your story straight, right? So that's pretty sad. The birthplace of Jesus is another interesting deal. We have Jesus of Nazareth, and we have Jesus born in Bethlehem. Well, the Bethlehem part is because there was some sort of prophecy about the Davidic line being carried through a Messiah who would be born in Bethlehem. So they took great pains to have him born in Bethlehem. But then Jesus is supposedly from Nazareth, and then they had to kind of patch that up by having them roam around because of a census.
Yeah.
You know, a nine-month pregnancy woman running around the countryside. We have the missing 30 years of Jesus' life, so basically from his birth to the time when he starts to do the Sermon on the Mount, and the parts that were contained in the movie, the Passion of the Christ.
Okay.
We basically have no, or almost no, stories about Jesus. So if he was such an important person, you'd think there'd be a little chronicling of what happened in his youth and adolescence, but there's nothing there. There's a lot of confusion about the resurrection story, but I won't go into that now. So we have this myth problem, right? And we have Christianity. We got this conflict between, thou shalt not bear false witness, and Christianity being founded on a myth. And I would love one of the callers to call in and tell me how they reconcile those two things. How they say, on the one hand, we don't want to lie. It's a bad thing to lie.
Of course.
How can you, and then the other hand, Christianity being sort of based on this myth. And
so basically the idea is that there are lots and lots of precursors to Christ, other gods and other prophets and other deities that had supposedly come before him, that are exactly the same. Virgin birth, December 25th, 12 apostles.
Right, right. In fact, people have made the case that there's nothing there except stories that came from somewhere else.
Yeah.
That all of the episodes of Jesus' life were, and this is one of the books that does that, by the way. There are many books that do this, but this is called The Jesus Puzzle by Earl Doherty. And anyway, this is a good read. I recommend checking that out. There are lots of books that have the similar sort of take on the subject.
Okay.
So,
all right. So yeah, I mean, apart from there being 35 different gods that came before Jesus that shared the same story, there being no evidence outside of the Bible to back up Jesus' character, the evidence within the Bible is contradictory.
Right.
To the order of 133.
Yeah. Well, in fact, they're working very hard to promote another story, for this Davidic line thing, and that. Yeah. So it's kind of ironic in a way that this other myth that they've so carefully constructed didn't even make the marquee.
So good. All that, and the lack of any physical evidence for any godlike activity going on. Right. It's most likely a myth.
Yeah, so it's pretty amazing why people believe that. So, how can you trust the church when they're telling you these lies?
Well, there's something you don't learn in Sunday school.
Yeah, yeah.